Welcome to the Psychotherapy Brown Bag YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and a couple of stories we've written about it, and a couple of stories that have come out in various media outlets about it over the last week. Today's date is Wednesday, January 13th. We have a story we put out on Psychotherapy Brown Bag, which again, for those of you who are new to our site, is www.psychotherapybrownbag.com, and it came out on January 6th, and we have one that's coming out tomorrow, so Thursday, January 14th at around 9 a.m. It's set to go up. And so both of our stories have covered this study that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association, written by Jay Fournier, Robert DeRubis, Steve Hull, and several other folks, and apologies if I mispronounce any of those names. And these guys were looking at to what degree do antidepressants help the folks who come in for depression who have mild depression or moderate or even severe depression, as opposed to the folks who have very severe depression. The vast majority of people come in for treatment for depression are depressed, and it's interfering with their life, and it's something that needs, requires help, but it isn't quite the severe depression that a lot of the patients in clinical trials actually have. And so again, they're looking to say, well, is the impact that we're getting for these folks who are really severely depressed the same as what we're getting for the vast majority of folks who come in and see their general practitioner or their psychiatrist and need help and get prescribed an antidepressant? So this story has caused a bit of an uproar based on the results. And so what these folks did is they conducted a form of meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis is a study of studies. So rather than just having a bunch of folks come in and collecting data on those individuals, you say, here are all these studies that have been published. Let's see if we can combine them and get an overall sort of average result from them. And on our website, I've spent a decent amount of time critiquing meta-analyses for a lot of reasons, and this isn't any exception to that, although they did some things differently that I like a lot. And I'm looking at my computer as I summarize this, so I don't miss anything. And so these guys looked for, out of all the trials on antidepressant medications, they wanted to find randomly controlled trials, so sort of a gold standard approach to ensuring that the study is run properly and you're getting the right amount of control over being able to determine whether what's having the impact is what you think it is. They wanted to make sure that all the antidepressants in these studies were FDA approved in the treatment of major or minor depression, because again, they're trying to include folks who aren't as severely depressed in this sample. They also included the studies if they were able to attain the original data, which I'm going to come back to in a second, if they were adult outpatients, so they weren't inpatient hospitalized populations. They were adults over the age of 18 coming in for treatment in a community center or something along those lines. Medication versus placebo was compared for at least 6 weeks. And another important point, that they were not excluded on the basis of placebo washout period, which I'm going to explain in a second. And their last thing was they wanted to make sure that all the studies that they included used the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. So 3 really important points. 1 is that they were able to attain the original data. 2 is that there's no placebo washout period. And 3 is that they all used the same scale. So the easiest one of those points to address is that they all use the same scale. So when I criticize meta-analyses a lot, it's because they'll take a bunch of studies that measure things differently, or measure several things differently, and they combine them into one single result and then compare them to each other. But that's not really a valid way of looking at things. It ends up masking a lot of results and changing what the original study actually said. So these authors didn't do that. They said, we're only going to look at one outcome measure, so we're comparing apples to apples instead of apples to oranges, which is great. The second thing to consider is the fact that they attain the original data. So in meta-analysis, usually you're comparing one big study or several studies to one another, and rather than looking at the individual data for each person and running the analyses you can do with that, they look at sort of the means and standard deviations of the whole sample, which I know is a sort of statistical nerd talk, but it's an important point. These guys didn't just look at the average, they looked at the individual participants, which let them have this massive sample of over 700 patients, which is a really big deal because it enables them to actually detect differences between groups very easily, which is hard to do sometimes in meta-analyses. And then that third point, the placebo washout period. So there's a tendency in a lot of clinical trials for antidepressants to do this washout period, where what they'll do is before they've randomized people to receive one treatment or the other, everybody's put on a placebo. Obviously, they don't know it's a placebo. And over a period of maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, they look to see, well, who responds really well to this placebo? And the folks who respond well to the placebo then are not included in the study. And so what they're trying to do there, they say, is to get rid of the placebo effect in their study, so that they can show that when people get better from the antidepressant, it's just because of the antidepressant. The problem with that is that when you're comparing folks with antidepressants to folks who are on placebos, and you've already eliminated people who don't respond to placebos, you're going to create an artificial difference between those groups, because the people who were going to respond to the placebo aren't in the study anymore. So you're comparing antidepressants to folks who don't respond to placebos and saying, did the folks with antidepressants do better than the folks who don't respond to placebos? And that's not really a valid comparison. And so, again, the authors here of this study that was just published in the Journal of American Medical Association said we're not going to go with that. We just want studies where everybody, regardless of how they respond to placebos, are included, so we can actually compare the antidepressant to what happens if someone thinks they're taking one but they're really getting a sugar pill. So what did they find? They actually found that as severity of depression goes up, the difference between antidepressants and placebos becomes stronger. So the more severe your depression, the better an antidepressant is for you. So that is a good thing. That means if you are very severely depressed, antidepressants are really strong. And so it's important to keep in mind these authors, us at PBB, none of us are saying that antidepressants are bad or medication is bad. Not at all. We're simply saying let's actually look at the evidence and see how strong is it really and for whom. And it's important because what they found is that for people who had mild, moderate, or even severe depression, the antidepressants were not much, if any, better than placebos. And that's a big deal, because that means you have a lot of folks who are coming in and getting prescribed something that may or may not actually need to be prescribed. And given that there are several empirically supported treatments for depression that are psychosocial, so cognitive behavioral therapy or interpersonal psychotherapy or CBASP, given that you have these alternative options, if people were coming in and getting prescribed a medication that actually isn't doing what people think they would do, that's a problem, because the vast majority of people who are depressed fall in that category, not in the very depressed category. And so there's been a bit of a backlash. Several articles come out in the New York Times. Some folks are saying, this is good, it calls attention to a problem. We need to run more studies like this and on psychotherapy to see, how different treatments impact different levels of depression, and that's a good response. But there's another response that came out yesterday or the day before in the Times by a psychiatrist named Richard Freeman, who claimed otherwise. And I'm going to link to all those articles on this video, so you can either go to PBB or you can click on some of the links that are here and you can read that info for yourself. But the bottom line, the thing to keep in mind is the message from the story is it is only one study. You can't completely throw everything out the window because of one study, and the authors of the study itself say that same thing. But what you can do is start to think of things a little bit differently and say, maybe if all these trials are on very severely depressed people, and a lot of these trials have this placebo washout period, maybe we're not getting the information. Maybe the numbers can't tell us what we need to know from those studies, and we need to try something a little bit differently. And so a study like this needs to be replicated independently by other people several times before we start to say this is conclusively the truth. But it should also be a wake-up call and a motivation to run some other studies and help us look at things differently so we can understand to what degree are antidepressants helping different groups of people, because they're definitely a valuable tool, but it's best to know exactly what things tend to do and for whom, and not to just make general assumptions about them. So that's sort of where we're at on this one, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, and I hope that you'll go to psychotherapybrownbag.com and share them with us on the story itself, and read the stories, because what I can say here versus what we can write on the site, it's a big difference. It's going to be much more detailed when I have time to sit and write it. So, but I do hope to hear your thoughts, and I hope that you read the actual study itself and the articles that came after it, so you can make your own sort of informed decisions on these. So, thanks.